The enemy's codes had been broken, and our trap was perfectly set. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, I stood on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, watching our dauntless dive bombers warm up for launch, their engines roaring like angry lions preparing to strike. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before us, painted gold by the rising sun, a deceptively peaceful facade for waters that were about to become the graveyard of the Imperial Japanese Navy's proudest carriers. Somewhere out there, roughly 200 miles northwest of Midway Island, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's 4 carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were steaming confidently toward their target. These were the very ships that had devastated Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, and now their decks were loaded with aircraft, their crews preparing for what they believed would be another easy victory. What they did not know was that we had been reading their encrypted messages for weeks, knew their exact location, and were about to spring the most devastating ambush in naval history. My name is Norman Jack Dusty Kleiss, a lieutenant junior grade and a dive bomber pilot with Scouting Squadron 6 aboard the Enterprise. Born in Coffeyville, Kansas in 1916, I had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1938 and earned my wings in April of 1941, flying combat missions since the Marshall Islands raids. By June of 1942, I thought I understood carrier warfare, but nothing could have prepared me for what we were about to witness: the complete destruction of Japan's carrier force in mere minutes, an event that would change the entire course of the Pacific War. The ready room aboard the Enterprise had been thick with cigarette smoke at 0400 hours on June 4th as Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, Jr., our air group commander, stood at the front with his pointer. McCluskey was a 1926 Naval Academy graduate who had taken command of the air group just 2 months earlier. Addressing us, he announced that the Japanese carrier force had been located approximately 200 miles northwest of Midway, tapping the map to indicate the 4 carriers, accompanied by 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers. These were not just any carriers. They were the heart of the Kido Butai, the mobile strike force. The Akagi and Kaga were Pearl Harbor veterans, massive ships capable of launching over 60 aircraft each, while the Soryu and Hiryu were newer, faster, and equally deadly. Together, they carried 248 aircraft and the most experienced carrier pilots in the world. Yet, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo had been decrypting the Japanese naval code, JN-25, giving us full access to their operational plans. The intelligence officer explained the details of Operation MI, Admiral Yamamoto's elaborate plan to capture Midway and destroy our carrier force. It involved invasion forces from the southwest, a diversionary attack in the Aleutians, and the main carrier strike force from the northwest, with Yamamoto himself commanding from the battleship Yamato, 300 miles behind. The Japanese were scheduled to launch their Midway strike at 0430, meaning that while their fighters were engaged and their carriers were recovering and rearming aircraft, their most vulnerable moment, we would strike. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, commanding Scouting Squadron 6, made careful notes, while beside him, Lieutenant Richard Best from Bombing Squadron 6 studied the weather conditions. With the wind from the southeast at 5 knots and scattered clouds at 1,500 feet, the conditions were perfect for diving. I looked around at my squadron mates, a mix of combat veterans and pilots facing their first battle, and we all understood the stakes. The Japanese had superior Zero fighters that could outmaneuver anything we had, and we would be operating at extreme fuel range, 175 miles out and back with minimal reserves. McCluskey added that Torpedo 8 from the Hornet would go in first, followed by the dive bombers launching at 0700. By 0600, The Enterprise flight deck was a scene of controlled chaos, with deck crews in colored jerseys performing their specialized tasks, red shirts loading bombs, purple shirts fueling aircraft, and brown shirts checking mechanical systems. I walked toward my aircraft, an SBD Dauntless with Bureau number 639, where my rear gunner, John Snowden, was already checking his twin 30-caliber machine guns. Snowden, a quiet man from Illinois who had saved my life before by spotting incoming Zeros, greeted me as I climbed up, remarking that it was going to be a hot day. I ran through my pre-flight inspection, checking control surfaces, the bomb rack, and the fuel load, which consisted of 230 gallons in the main tank plus two 58-gallon wing tanks. With careful management, this gave us about 4.5 hours of flight time in the SBD Dauntless, a plane that wasn't the fastest with its 255 miles per hour top speed, but was incredibly stable in a dive and tough enough to absorb punishment that would destroy other aircraft. I strapped into the cockpit, surrounded by the familiar instruments indicating altitude, airspeed, fuel levels, engine temperature, and oil pressure. At 0645, the order to start engines came over the loudspeaker, and I pressed the starter, bringing the Wright R-1820 Cyclone engine to life with a roar. First to launch were the fighters, 20 F-4F Wildcats for combat air patrol, followed by the 14 TBD Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 6 under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, lumbering down the deck with their Mark 13 torpedoes and barely clearing the edge. Finally, it was our turn, with 18 planes from Scouting 6 under Gallagher and 15 from Bombing 6 under Best. I was positioned as number 2 in the 3rd Division, with McCluskey leading us all. The launch was always a dangerous procedure as the Enterprise turned into the wind to increase speed to 30 knots. The flight deck officer whirled his flag for full power, and the moment it dropped, I released the brakes and surged forward, watching the island flash by as the deck edge approached. When the airspeed indicator hit 65 knots, I gently pulled back on the stick, feeling the heavy bomber hang suspended for a heart-stopping moment before the wings finally bit into the air and we began our ascent. My gunner, Snowden, cracked over the intercom to compliment the takeoff and remind me to stay alert, while I focused on the grueling task of forming up the strike force. It took a full hour to assemble the formation, but by 0806, 33 dive bombers from Enterprise were climbing steadily toward 19,000 feet. The planned rendezvous with the Hornet Air Group never materialized, forcing Lieutenant Commander McCluskey to make the difficult decision to proceed alone rather than waste precious fuel waiting. We flew northwest at 19,000 feet under strict radio silence, a tension-filled void where I constantly scanned my instruments and bomb sight, knowing that at this altitude I would have perhaps 10 seconds to line up a target with no second chance. By 0920, we reached the intercept point, only to find an empty ocean. My fuel gauge showed over half consumed, leaving me with a terrifying calculation of maybe 30 minutes to find the enemy, before we faced the choice of turning back or ditching. The radio silence felt physically oppressive as every pilot performed the same grim fuel calculations, until 0955, when McCluskey waggled his wings to signal a change in course. Looking down, I spotted the white wake of a lone destroyer racing northeast, and McCluskey turned to follow it, gambling that it was hurrying to rejoin the main fleet. After 20 agonizing minutes of chasing that wake while our fuel dropped toward empty, the Japanese fleet finally appeared at 10:20, looking like scattered toys on a blue carpet. 4 carriers in 2 groups, surrounded by escorts and maneuvering violently. Incredibly, there were no Zero fighters at our altitude to intercept us, as they were all trapped down low finishing off the torpedo squadrons. McCluskey broke silence to order Scouting 6 to take the left carrier and Bombing 6 the right. But in the ensuing confusion, both squadrons began their dives on the carrier Kaga. I pushed the stick forward, and nosed into my dive, the brutal acceleration pressing me back into my seat as the altimeter frantically unwound past 18,000, then 15,000, and down to 12,000 feet. The carrier grew rapidly in my bomb sight, and despite the black puffs of flak bursting around us, I held the plane steady, spotting individual aircraft on Kaga's deck being refueled and rearmed at 10,000 feet, their most vulnerable moment. Gallagher released first, his bomb striking near the island and blowing bodies into the air, and at 2,500 feet, I pressed my release and pulled back hard. 9 Gs crushed me into my seat, tunneling my vision as the Dauntless groaned and leveled out just above the water, while Snowden shouted that we had scored a direct hit on the forward elevator. Kaga's forward deck erupted in flames as Gallagher hit aft and others struck home, resulting in 4 direct hits that engulfed the ship from stem to stern within seconds. Simultaneously, Dick Best realized the targeting error, pulled out of his dive early, and led 2 wingmen toward the carrier Akagi. Best drove his 1,000-pound bomb through Akagi's deck amidships, penetrating the hangar and exploding among the armed aircraft, instantly transforming the flagship into a raging inferno. At exactly 10:22, Yorktown's dive bombers arrived to attack Soryu, landing 3 1,000-pound bombs within 30 seconds and creating a pillar of fire reaching 1,000 feet into the air. As we pulled away, leaving 3 carriers mortally wounded in mere minutes, the scene below was hellish. Kaga was a floating volcano with explosions rippling through her. Akagi burned from bow to stern with her deck buckling, and Soryu listed heavily before rolling over and slipping beneath the waves, taking over 700 men down with her. We had missed the carrier Hiryu, hidden by a rain squall 10 miles north, and she was already launching counterstrikes against our fleet. Zeros dove on us from 3 o'clock high, their tracers whipping past as Snowden's guns chattered in defense, downing 1 fighter while I pushed the nose forward to utilize our superior diving speed to escape. The flight back was a nightmare of fuel management. With the gauge bouncing on empty, I leaned the mixture until the engine ran rough, risking fouled plugs to squeeze out a few more minutes of flight time, while other Dauntlesses around me trailed smoke or ran dry. The radio channels filled with desperate calls of pilots ditching. But finally, Enterprise appeared on the horizon, turning into the wind for recovery. I requested an immediate landing due to emergency fuel status and was cleared as number 3. But as I entered the pattern, my engine sputtered and quit completely, forcing a dead stick approach. Trading my remaining altitude for speed, I lowered the gear and flaps, aiming for the number 3 wire. The wheels hit and bounced, but the tailhook caught the wire and slammed us to a stop, just as the deck crew rushed out to help. The crew pulled Snowden from the rear cockpit, wounded in the shoulder and leg, but conscious, while I marveled at how my plane had held together after sustaining over 40 hits. The mood in the ready room was somber, despite the victory. Hornet's Torpedo 8 had been completely wiped out, with 29 of 30 men killed, including John Waldron, who had led them straight in with a final vow never to turn back. Though no torpedoes hit, their sacrifice had pulled the Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the carriers exposed for our attack. And as McCluskey entered with a bandaged shoulder, he confirmed the grim but triumphant tally. Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu were finished. Intelligence reports confirmed that the Hiryu, still fully operational, had successfully struck the Yorktown. By noon, she had sustained 3 bomb hits, followed by 2 torpedo strikes at 14:30, leaving her listing so severely that the order was given to abandon ship. Yet her sacrifice was not in vain, for it purchased the critical time needed to locate the Hiryu. The human cost was staggering. with Japanese casualties estimated at 2,500 thus far. Officers noted that of the 1,200 to 1,500 crew and airmen on each carrier, very few were rescued. Each statistic represented a living person, a son, a husband, or a father, who perished in fire and water thousands of miles from home, sacrificed for the ambition of an empire. That afternoon marked our resurgence, as we launched once more against the enemy. 24 dive bombers located the Hiryu at 1700 hours, delivering 4 direct bomb hits that left her burning through the night until she was finally scuttled. With her destruction, the formidable Kido Butai effectively ceased to exist, and in the days that followed, we pursued the retreating Japanese forces, successfully sinking the cruiser Mikuma. The strategic consequences of the engagement soon crystallized, revealing a catastrophe for Japan, which had lost 4 fleet carriers that had taken years to construct and could not be swiftly replaced. Even more devastating was the human toll. Over 3,000 highly trained sailors and airmen were lost, including more than 100 veteran pilots whose years of experience and intuitive understanding of carrier operations were utterly irreplaceable. The Japanese Navy, having started the war with 6 large carriers and now reduced to 2, would never truly recover. Or they could build new hulls. The institutional knowledge of their finest carrier divisions died on that 4th of June, leaving them unable to train new pilots to make those future ships effective. For the American forces, Midway served as definitive proof that superior intelligence could triumph over a numerical disadvantage. Rochefort's codebreakers had handed us the enemy's entire operational plan, allowing us to position ourselves for maximum tactical advantage. Without this foresight, you can be certain we would have been forced into a reactive posture, arriving too late and fighting entirely on their terms. The battle laid bare critical weaknesses in the Japanese strategy, particularly Yamamoto's overly complex plan, which scattered his forces across thousands of miles, rendering them unable to support one another. Strict radio silence further crippled their ability to coordinate when the plan unraveled, compounded by a fatal underestimation of American capabilities and the assumption that we would react predictably. Admiral Nagumo was left facing an impossible dilemma when scouts reported American ships at 0728, caught rearming for a second strike on Midway. His 30-minute hesitation on whether to launch immediately or wait to properly arm proved catastrophic. For by the time he decided, we were already diving. That night, as the Enterprise steamed southwest, I stood on the deck beneath the stars, the same stars that had hung over Pearl Harbor 6 months prior and had now witnessed the death of 4 carriers in a single day. With the adrenaline faded, leaving only exhaustion and a profound emptiness, my thoughts turned to the torpedo crews who had flown knowingly into certain death. Waldron's men understood perfectly well that their TBD devastators were obsolete death traps against the Zeros. Yet they held their course while being shot to pieces, unwavering in their duty. George Gay was forced to watch his friends perish, one by one, seeing Waldron's plane explode and the other devastators cartwheel into the ocean in flames. He survived by floating for 30 hours in shark-infested waters, hiding under a seat cushion to avoid detection by Japanese ships, until a PBY finally rescued him. The weight of that ordeal left him with a survivor's guilt that would endure for the rest of his life. I also found myself thinking about the Japanese sailors I had helped to kill. When diving on the carriers, you see men running on the deck, manning guns, and desperately pushing burning aircraft over the side. These were not faceless enemies, but young men just like us, fighting for their country, including pilots from the Kaga and Akagi who had been flying since the China campaign in 1937. They had families and dreams that ended in fire that June morning, leaving the ocean littered with bodies, where, Despite some rescues by destroyers, thousands died from burns, drowning, or shark attacks, proving that war is never clean or glorious, but simply young men dying far from home. Historians have rightly identified Midway as the definitive turning point of the Pacific War, where the balance of naval power shifted decisively in a single day. Japan plummeted from a position of carrier superiority to mere parity, while American shipyards began an acceleration that would soon doom the enemy to hopeless inferiority. The true victory, however, lay in the combination of combat power, training, and morale. While Japan lost an irreplaceable generation of pilots at Midway and through the attrition of Guadalcanal, their training programs, producing perhaps 100 carrier pilots a year, could never hope to match the American machine that would soon churn out thousands. Admiral Nimitz later attributed the victory to three factors: the intelligence officers who broke the codes, the damage control crews who repaired the Yorktown in 72 hours when estimates suggested 3 months, and the pilots who pressed their attacks against overwhelming odds. This American victory was also a triumph of industry. Even as we fought at Midway, the new Essex-class carriers, ships that dwarfed anything Japan could produce, were already under construction. While America would eventually launch 24 Essex-class vessels, Japan struggled to complete just 6 new carriers, mostly inferior conversions, meaning the carefully crafted force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months effectively died at Midway. As for my own journey, I survived the war after flying 85 combat missions, receiving credit for hitting 3 ships at Midway, the carriers Kaga and Hiryu, and the cruiser Nagumo, for which I was awarded the Navy Cross. I eventually retired as a captain in 1962 after serving in Korea, and lived to the age of 100, passing in 2016 as one of the last surviving Midway dive bomber pilots. McCluskey also recovered, retiring as a rear admiral in 1956, though he never sought recognition for his history-changing decision to follow that destroyer. His son Phil described him as a quiet man who was not a big talker, and when he died in 1976, his pivotal role was largely forgotten. George Gay went on to become a TWA pilot after the war, spending decades honoring his squadron's sacrifice through speeches and his book, Sole Survivor. He passed away in 1994, and his ashes were scattered over the site where his squadron went down, finally rejoining the men he had seen die 52 years earlier. Dick Best, who sank the Akagi with 1 perfect bomb, was medically retired after inhaling caustic soda from a defective oxygen canister. Though permanently grounded with damaged lungs, he lived until 2001, often celebrated as the man who won Midway. Today, the Japanese carriers rest on the Pacific floor at depths exceeding 17,000 feet. The Kaga was located in 2019, sitting upright with her hull intact but deck destroyed, while the Akagi lies nearby bearing the scars of massive fire damage. They remain silent war graves, the tombs of thousands, including the legacy of Admiral Nagumo, who survived the battle but never truly recovered. Following the disaster at Midway, the Japanese commanders faced grim fates. Vice Admiral Nagumo was relegated to coastal defense on Saipan, where he eventually took his own life in July 1944 as American forces overwhelmed the island. His chief of staff, Kusaka, survived the war and later wrote extensively, accepting full responsibility while defending the impossible tactical decisions Nagumo was forced to make during the heat of battle. Captain Fuchida, the leader of the Pearl Harbor attack, was aboard the flagship Akagi during the engagement and suffered 2 broken ankles from an explosion. Yet, he managed to escape the sinking vessel. In the post-war era, he underwent a profound transformation, becoming a Christian missionary dedicated to promoting reconciliation and understanding between Japan and the United States. It is frequently observed that the Empire of Japan effectively lost the war within a span of merely 5 minutes at Midway. Admiral Yamamoto, who would later be killed in April 1943 when American P-38s intercepted his flight over Bougainville using decoded intelligence, realized the inevitability of defeat immediately after the battle, reportedly confessing to his staff that he had sent many young men to their deaths that day. Today, the Midway Atoll stands as a designated national memorial. The very runways where Marines once braced against insurmountable odds have been reclaimed by nature as a wildlife sanctuary. Where falling bombs once shattered the earth, albatrosses now nest in peace, marking a stark and healing contrast between the violence of the past and the tranquility of the present. The account of Norman Kleiss serves as a humble reminder that we did not view ourselves as heroes, but rather as young men simply executing necessary duties. True heroism was found in the torpedo crews, who launched their attacks with the certainty of death, as well as the codebreakers toiling in secrecy, the mechanics ensuring aircraft remained airworthy, and the damage control teams performing miracles to save lives and ships against impossible odds. The engagement at Midway demonstrated that victory in war is not solely determined by superior machinery or seasoned warriors, but by the capacity to adapt, seize fleeting opportunities, sustain losses, and persist. While the Japanese Imperial Navy possessed more skilled pilots, better aircraft, and greater combat experience, we countered with cracked codes, radar technology, and superior damage control protocols. Furthermore, the enemy lacked the industrial capacity to replace their losses, whereas American production capabilities could replenish forces tenfold. Crucially, the outcome hinged on leaders who understood the necessity of calculated risk. Admiral Nimitz gambled his entire carrier force on intelligence that could have been potentially flawed, while Lieutenant Commander McCluskey risked running out of fuel to locate the Japanese fleet. Individual initiative proved decisive, with pilots like Best wagering everything to attack a different carrier with only 2 wingmen, and Waldron leading his squadron to certain destruction because the mission demanded it. Although the battle spanned 2 days, the strategic landscape was altered forever. Prior to this clash, the Japanese advance seemed unstoppable, yet afterwards, they never secured another offensive victory. The war ground on for 3 more harrowing years, claiming hundreds of thousands of additional lives. But the ultimate conclusion was sealed during those critical minutes on June 4th. It was then that American dive bombers intercepted the Japanese carriers, while their decks were crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft, turning the tide of the conflict in a single, devastating strike. One can easily imagine how history might have diverged if McCluskey had turned back when he found the intercept point empty, or if the Japanese had launched their strike just 30 minutes earlier. Had the American torpedoes functioned correctly, and Torpedo Squadron 8 succeeded, the narrative would be vastly different. Indeed, the fate of nations often hangs on small decisions, moments of chance, and individual choices. However, history is written by what actually transpired on that morning in June 1942, when a smaller force of American pilots, flying inferior machines, caught the most powerful carrier fleet in the world at its moment of maximum vulnerability. Through a combination of intelligence, raw courage, immense sacrifice, and sheer luck, they destroyed it and reversed the momentum of the entire war. For today's generation, it is difficult to conceive of a world where democracy itself is in peril and the survival of freedom is an open question. But that was the reality we faced. In June 1942, the destiny of the free world rested squarely on the shoulders of a few hundred pilots operating from 3 carriers in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Against all logic and overwhelming odds, we proved to be enough, teaching the enduring lesson of Midway that ordinary people can rise to meet extraordinary circumstances. Democracy is capable of producing warriors just as brave as those of any totalitarian system, proving that free men fighting to protect their homes and families constitute the most formidable force on Earth. The statistics record that 3,057 Japanese and 362 Americans perished, with 4 Japanese carriers sunk against the loss of 1 American vessel. Yet beyond these cold numbers lies the tragedy that every single digit represents a human being with hopes, dreams, and loved ones. Young men who should have lived to see their grandchildren instead died amidst fire and water. The Pacific rolls on unchanged, bearing no physical scars from the battle, and the coordinates where the great ships went down remain nothing more than patches of open ocean. Nevertheless, as long as free people exist, we must remember Midway and the men who, in a few devastating minutes, saved the world by reducing the pride of the Imperial Navy to burning wrecks before breakfast. The legacy of Midway is defined by dive bomber pilots who pressed their attacks against impossible odds, thereby deciding the course of the war and the future of freedom. This victory stands not merely as a military triumph, but as a testament that when tyranny threatens, free people will rise to meet it, demonstrating that courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to act despite it. The fallen from both sides, American pilots flying to their deaths to protect liberty, and Japanese sailors dying in attempts to save their burning ships, deserve to be remembered as human beings who gave their lives for their countries. While all these brave men deserved better than early graves in the Central Pacific, their sacrifice was not in vain, for freedom survived and eventually flourished. The Pacific, once a theater of war, is now a peaceful expanse traversed by merchant vessels rather than warships, and the bitter enemies of Japan and America have become close allies. As the war recedes over 75 years into the past, soon there will be no one left who can say they witnessed Kaga explode, watched Akagi burn, or dove through walls of flak to hit their target. Yet the story must endure, because those who value liberty need to understand that it is not free. It was purchased with the blood of men who climbed into obsolete planes and gave everything to stop tyranny. On that clear morning in June 1942, when the fate of the world hung in the balance, American pilots tipped the scales toward freedom, changing history forever.